title of this lecture is Whitehall as Architectural and Cultural Icon. And my interest, or the focus of the talk this evening, is to look at this first as a structure of the 18th century, of course, with the prominent figure of Dean George Berkeley, who lived there. Then the rediscovery, and I would call it the reinterpretation of the site and the man himself as cultural icons in the mid to late 19th century. And I'm a firm believer in not only the original object, the original historical event, but the importance of those who mythologized it, interpreted it in painting, literature, both fiction and nonfiction, because oftentimes sometimes it's swathed in a romantic veil when people look at the past, but it does and did raise awareness. And without that cultural awareness, many times sites are not preserved. So the romantic view taken often has a real world application in terms of actual preservation. Let me advance the image here, 1 second. That is not, oh, there we go. The house known as Whitehall gained its fame, its prominence through the arrival of Dean George Berkeley here, and you see him here in the portrait known as the Bermuda Group. I think it's interesting in this portrait that behind them is a classical colonnade, fictional, of course, and then a natural landscape behind them. Why do I think this is so important? Let's look at the larger context of Newport in the 18th century. British North America, British colonial America, was imposing an empire on a new world. It was also imposing a classical tradition on what they considered a new world to them. And they're going to shape it, rename it, to serve their purposes, their needs, their tastes. Classical learning. Berkeley was a scholar. Of course, he was coming and spent a short time in Middletown and Newport, awaiting that funding that never came, of course, for the school he wanted to establish in the New World, and returned to Europe. But of course, his arrival in Newport is noted for the cultural flowering that it was part of. Was he the sole instigator of it? No. The merchants and people of letters and intellectual interests were there in Newport, but it was a spark. It was definitely a spark. And of course, the Society for the Propagation of Knowledge and Virtue through Free Conversation was founded by these individuals who combined their books, gathered for conversation, and eventually that would result in the creation of the Redwood Library Company long after Berkeley left. It's interesting, in his party was John Tschirch, the painter, who left behind several portraits of Newport merchants. But for me, it's the colonnade in this portrait that is very telling in terms of the cultural impact he had on Rhode Island. Because now, the Redwood Library in Newport, one of the oldest libraries in continuous use and one of the earliest temple-fronted buildings in the British colonies. It was actually built in 1748. Again, Berkeley was long gone. However, this idea of imposing a classical culture on a new world was paramount. And when I look at the portrait here, I can imagine the Redwood Library later on. It didn't exist yet, but the notion that one dwelleth in a temple, and this building was dedicated to the ideals of the Enlightenment of the time. And of course, Berkeley himself was a leading figure in the English Enlightenment, amongst a coterie of scientists, writers, playwrights, artists. Well, let's go to his house. Possibly a simple farmhouse in Middletown. But look at what is imposed upon this very simple house: a classical pediment, the triangular pediment over the front door, and 2 classical columns at either side. The door was paramount in the architecture of England and its British colonies in the 18th century. It was the focal point of the building. And just as later on, you have a high style building, this is the ultimate pediment in Newport. But here you have the template of the colonial house, or what we would call the Georgian house of the 18th century. What's intriguing about Whitehall is that the front of the building portrays itself as a very grand Georgian house, whereas the back of the building is a very modest rural building. The two sides are interesting. A classical temple front imposed on a new world, a rather rustic new world. But when one turns the corner, it's really quite extraordinary. The building plays with the salt box type of the 17th and 18th centuries in New England, with this long wing and the slanted roof facing north. What is rather unique and almost eccentric is this pronounced cornice on this side, because of course you wanted to lend grandeur to the front. And here, to me, this is colonial America, a combination of both practicality, which is what this really deals with, because the salt box was a good way to add on rooms as society stabilized, because this is a society in survivalist mode, establishing again communities on the eastern seaboard. But as society began to stabilize during that second half of the 1700s, when Berkeley arrives, and especially towards the mid-18th century, you see many 18th century buildings that are additive. They were not always, as we see them today, original. They have smaller buildings added on. This is a simple two-room house added on and given a grandeur in front. This was a template. This was a type of building we'll see throughout Newport as well, with the merchant aristocracy, the oligarchy rising. And you'll see this type of wooden architecture. I see it as one of the primary art forms of British North America. It was a land of wood, the entire eastern seaboard. That is the material that was prevalent. And so the two art forms that tend to emerge first, architecture and furniture making. The Townsend Goddards of Newport, the great architects, and the fine quality woodworking from the grandest house to the most modest in this period. Let's look at a larger context for the salt box. This is the Thomas Lee House in East Lyme, Connecticut, late 17th century. You see, it begins life as what is known as the hall and parlor house, with a central chimney, which becomes like a furnace because you keep that fire going all year, the bricks will warm up. And again, as society stabilized, as one became more prosperous, as one had more needs, you then added rooms at the back, and the salt box is created. For example, let's look at this rather rustic plan, but I think it really does tell the tale. Here you have the simple hall house with a loft above, where people would sleep. This is the type of building you would see at Plymouth Plantation and those recreations. This is the type of medieval house many of Britain lived in the old country. The simple dwelling with a large-scale fireplace, those stones are heated up. The staircase here on the left, if you follow the cursor, is more like a ladder. It's so steep. Then it can evolve into the hall parlor house. The hall, cooking, communal life, the parlor, a finer room, sometimes also the main bedroom of the house, and then other rooms upstairs in the loft area. But then the house grows, the hall parlor, and now so you have you have the double fireplace. Here, the center entrance, the staircase here, again, a very steep staircase. The second floor would project out further, as you see on the top. This is a type of house that you see often still surviving from the late 17th century in the North Shore of Massachusetts, in the area of Essex, Ipswich, and whatnot. Well, as life evolves, the hall parlor, the hall can also become much more of a sitting room. And in the back, under the salt box, is the kitchen. You also can have smaller rooms, pantries, small rooms known as sometimes invalids' rooms, boarding rooms, additional bedrooms for extended families. So that is the building type that Whitehall is really part of. It's that tradition. Then come to Newport, though, and how Newport will interpret its architecture, and how does Whitehall fit in, since it's truly only a stone's throw from the city. We remind ourselves Newport is founded in 1639, and being in the colony of Rhode Island, which is founded upon the principle of freedom of conscience, no one religious denomination dominates in Newport. How does this play out in the city plan and its architecture, practiced both in town and in those farm buildings, both modest and grand country estates, which would pepper the island throughout Middletown, where Whitehall is, and right up through Portsmouth? If you notice this image of Newport entitled Newport in, it's funny, it's called Newport in 1730. That's impossible because the Colony House is here, and the Colony House was finished in 1741. So it's Newport in the 1740s. But you notice the number of church steeples, but no one church building or house of worship dominates a public square. This is a city of wharves. They dominate the seaport. And the main square, which would become the Parade, and then Washington Square with Long Wharf, a government building, dominates. So I always say Newport is a place where freedom of conscience and commerce share equal space. And we think about the building tradition. You see this throughout the island. And so here on Thames Street, the northern section of Thames Street, we see one of the more intact 18th century neighborhoods in the entire nation, because the northern part of Thames Street, and then working your way down through the Point District of Newport, has the largest known concentration of extant wooden British colonial buildings, pre-revolutionary. Notice here how they articulate the buildings, and we'll see the lessons of Whitehall reflected. Here, a clapboard building, a very fine building material, by the way, because wood shingle was the more common. But look at the doorway again. 2 columns and a pediment. The doorway was the main artistic expression and visual statement in an 18th century house. Because other than that, the technology of post and beam architecture is to create a box or a rectangle. And what we find in a place like Newport and its surrounding countryside are many variations of the classical doorway, which you would see in England, depending on income level, architectural sophistication, cultural aspiration. Here you see a simple transom, very simple, no elaborate carving. Here, a gambrel roofed house with no pediment, just a simple transom. As we move around, though, and visit the Point District, you see the variations. The structure is all the same, post and beam, clapboards. Here you see the simple transom. This is in the Point District, but here you see a more elaborate building with more classical allusions. The pediment over the doorway, like Whitehall, the columns at either side, and here with extra verve, so to speak, dormers that alternate between triangular pediment and curved pediment. That rhythm of triangular and curved pediment over windows, first of all, goes right back to ancient Rome. It's reinterpreted in the Italian Renaissance. That idea is brought with pattern books to England. Those pattern books are brought to America in that practice. So a 2,000-year-old tradition makes its way from the ancient world, usually rendered in stone, to a new world, a land of wood. But with the same architectural aspiration in mind, to be classical. And you see the variations. The box, the rectangle remains the same, but the doorways are where individuality within a classical framework can exist. Here, a little bit more elaborate, another house on the Point. 2 elaborate columns. I know it's a small image, but these are Corinthian capitals with acanthus leaves, much more elaborate, and a small fanlight above the door and a very elaborate pediment. So there are varying degrees. This on Bridge Street, the simplicity of this, no elaborate carving, just the simplicity of the architectural forms. And here on the Point, very handsome house, Newport Restoration Foundation building. This is a house that is a 3/4 plan, because here you have the original form of the house, the door, the windows symmetrically placed, but this is the add-on. It's not a grand Georgian house in the sense that the ideal was to have a central door and 2 windows at either side. Here you see a house growing over time as prosperity increases, as stability increases. And you have the handsomeness of the simple pediment and the simple pilasters or half columns. And then we come to Whitehall, which really does have a degree of grandeur to it. This is a historic American Building Survey photograph from the mid-20th century. Here you have Ionic scrolled pilasters. Now that's a great deal of both talent, skill, and historical reference, classical reference, because the proportions of these columns had to be done properly. Classicism is about proportion first, ornament second. The pattern book was an essential idea. If it wasn't the pattern book, then it was the skilled craftsman who could visually interpret. So you have the effect of a double door, the scrolled Ionic columns, and here is a curved, it's called a scotia. This curved element, this actually would bow forward, and then the elaborate dentils here. So it's a very grand door for a country house. And here it is today. You see the facade is very flat, just the simple clapboards, the simple window framing. But look at the effort to create a sculptural raised relief in the doorway. What I find interesting, you'll find many a doorway throughout Newport and the remnants of 18th century houses throughout Aquidneck Island, but it is this area above the Ionic columns that shows a level of effort and sophistication with this rounded element. There are also tooth-like elements here, which are called dental moldings, and then classical brackets. So double door grandeur. Now, there is another example of a grand double door, which were rare, by the way, and it's back in Newport at the Robinson House on Washington Street. Quaker Tom Robinson was one of the great Quaker grandees with his house lining the waterfront on the Point. Again, the Point was established when, excuse me, Nicholas Easton, in his will in the 1680s, deeded it to the Society of Friends. And then Anne Bull added more land. In 1725, the Point is laid out in a classical grid by Samuel Easton. And the Society of Friends minutes state we should look to our brethren in Philadelphia for a plan, because the Philadelphia plan by the Society of Friends had also been established by that time in a grid with streets named after numbers and trees. Point would follow suit. This original street was called Water Street. It was only named Washington Street later on. Now here, only half of the doorway works, you know, if you've ever had the opportunity to visit this house. So only one side works, which was typical of these doorways. But look at the pediment and the elaborate quality here. There are not many of these double doorways in Newport or Aquidneck Island. So it's a rarity. Now, this house represents a transition. You're looking on the front facade at a grand 18th century Newport house. Whitehall is a very modest building in back, a working farmhouse, but the front conveys the idea of grandeur. Well, if we fast forward almost a century later, from the mid-18th century to the mid to late 19th century, the Robinson House is a very storied building. The porch on the side was added by the architect Charles Follen McKim in the 1870s. At this time, he also commissioned a photographer to capture images of 18th century Newport buildings and objects of, quote, historical interest, end quote. Why is this important for Whitehall? This is really one of the early moments of the colonial revival. I've been discussing so far Newport's manifestation of architecture in the colonial period and Whitehall's creation at that time. But it's in the 1860s and 70s when, beginning in the Point District of Newport, actually, and then spanning outward, that there became a fascination for Newport's colonial past. As a new nation, as we were approaching the centennial of 1876, many American writers, architects, painters were writing essays and publishing them in Architectural Record and other magazines and stating, why are we copying European precedents when we have our own American traditions? Now, mind you, those American traditions were colonial imports of British classical architecture, but adapted for the climate and materials in wood of the New World. But here is Charles McKim in the early 1870s, redesigning the keeping room at the Robinson House, adding a bay window and adding a fireplace that is more colonial in style than the original colonial fireplace, with these elaborate balusters on the side, this fluting here. You'd never see that in a colonial building, and adding Dutch delft tiles here. It's a very romantic interpretation of this. Charles McKim was the third American to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Richard Morris Hunt was the first, famed for Marble House, the Breakers, the Griswold House in Newport, etc. And he summered in Newport on Bellevue Avenue. The second was Henry Hobson Richardson, who attended the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, who built the Watt Sherman House in Newport. Newport in the 19th century was like a living laboratory for leading figures in American architecture, working with each other, learning from one another. And a few years after this was designed, McKim forms McKim, Mead and White with Stanford White in 1879. So here's the keeping room. And then here's another one of the parlors where he is adding to the Belection woodwork. Now, McKim was so fascinated by the colonial period between 1872 and 73. He was working not only in Newport buildings, but he took a sketching tour of colonial New England towns. In that very same year of 1873, Charles Wentworth Higgins, who was a friend of Emily Dickinson, a noted American writer at the time, came to Newport and wrote romance novels, one called Oldport. He cast Newport as a fictional place called Oldport, and Malbone, an old-time romance. And he writes of the Point District and writes of colonial houses in the countryside. People realized by the mid-19th century, Newport, Middletown, Portsmouth were historic. This nation had a history. And here is a John P. Newell engraving of what was now known as Washington Square after the Revolution, with the Colony House, with the stately elm trees that were planted in the early 19th century. Now, mind you, around us, we have a burgeoning Victorian buildings, but all of these are 18th century buildings. These prints were becoming bestsellers. And in the 1860s, first of all, in 1854, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem about the Jewish cemetery in Newport. Emma Lazarus, who admired him at the tender age of 18 and 19, wrote a poem in the 1860s about Touro Synagogue. Colonial buildings were beginning to be celebrated, mythologized, and they were becoming the muses for writers, artists, painters, and architects. In Newport's first public park of 1854, Touro Park, which, by the way, is one of the earliest parks in America. The Public Garden in Boston is the oldest, from 1838. Here, 1854, on this piece of original colonial parcel that had belonged to the Arnold family, with the stone tower on it, Newport's oldest built structure as far as people knew, not built by the Vikings, but they did propagate that it was. They needed an American Stonehenge. You know, myth and reality intersect. Sometimes myth is more popular. It's no coincidence, though, that this park was created in 1854, the very year after Bellevue Avenue was laid out and christened. So the town is emerging as a resort. So the point is, a colonial era structure is the focal point of this new Victorian strolling park. And artists are coming to the town, especially in the 1870s and 80s, in search of natural landscapes, yes, but landscapes, as they said, touched by the hand of humankind, searching for the old colonial landscape. One of these was the author of this work, William Trost Richards, who in the late 1870s produced this painting called Old Orchard at Newport. He was fascinated by what he called the colonial landscape, the settled landscape, the pastoral landscape of meadows, sheep. Of course, sheep raising was typical of the 18th century, and it had deforested much of the island, which had already been settled by the Narragansetts. And when Europeans first came here, they did not come upon a virgin wilderness. They came upon a landscape worked by indigenous Americans for centuries. This is very much so. It's not a factual representation, but this is inspired by the hills and the meadows not far from Hanging Rock. So this is within the realm of Whitehall, Paradise Valley, this whole region in Middletown and northwards became very much a pilgrimage for artists, because they felt they literally were in a time capsule, a landscape that captured the past, that preserved the past, actually. Here, for example, Hanging Rock, nicknamed Berkeley's Rock, the idea that he, of course, true or not, walked here and composed the Minute Philosopher while sitting on this rock. You know, a gentleman of the old world, steeped in classical learning, here in the new world, predicting the future. You know, as he said, westward the course of empire takes its way in his poetry. Not a very politically sensitive remark anymore, but it was the zeitgeist of the time. This painting of Second Beach with Hanging Rock so prominently there is by Worthington Whitredge from 1878 to 1880. These were luminist painters coming to capture the misty, hazy atmosphere of Newport in summer. They were working in the Hudson River Valley. But again, here, the myth of Berkeley was already arising, that when you ventured out to this landscape, this somewhat rustic, wild landscape, you were in the realm of this great figure in history. For example, Worthington Whitredge's 1882 Old House by the Sea. No, this is not literally Whitehall, but you see this building in many guises. One old house by the sea has a salt box that looks strikingly like Whitehall. And then he amends that, he creates gambrel roofs, but the open fields, the view down to the beach, this is the pastoral landscape, unforested, unwooded, of this area of Middletown looking towards the ocean. And countless other painters would venture out here. John Lafarge, John Frederick Kensett, so many to mention, the leading lights of the period. But again, mythologizing what they felt was a surviving colonial landscape. Then we have the artist who ventured to Whitehall itself. This is Leigh Hunt from the late 1890s, circa 1890, with pen in hand. And here you see the salt box north side, the rear of Whitehall, with its what we call pastoral landscape, the landscape of farm and pasture land and meadow. Its trees, the orchards around the house, the outbuildings, and the back of the building now, with the view towards the ocean. Although in the 18th century, the focus was on the formal front and creating this classical grand house for the grand man himself, while the farm produced the things they needed, in the 19th century, the Romantic spirit was focused on something we would call the picturesque, the asymmetrical, the rustic. And so the rear of the building appealed to artists, not the formal front. It's interesting that Whitehall offered both versions. And of course, Charles McKim sends his photographer to capture Whitehall, not the formal front, but the salt box back, with its additive quality of other additions over time. Now, the choice of this side of the building, now mind you, this is 1872 to 74. The collection of photographs commissioned by McKim dealt with Newport architecture of the surrounding area. There's one photograph of an apple orchard, which they believed at the time to date from the colonial period. And there are articles of interest, historic chairs, Union Jack, and other objects. For this building, this is one of the earliest known published photographs of a colonial structure in American history when it was published in the New York Sketchbook of Architecture. And this is the one that made the cut of all the buildings it could have chosen. All the photographs were bound in what is now today known as the McKim portfolio, and it's on deposit at the Newport Historical Society. It's one of the earliest documents of the colonial revival movement in the country. And this is the man who produced the photographs, William James Stillman. Very prominent photographer from New York. McKim was based in New York in the wintertime. They knew each other. They traveled in the same artistic circles. William James Stillman was a remarkable photographer. This was a sketch done by his wife, Laura, in the 1860s. And in addition to Newport, this is what Stillman had done before he arrived in Newport. He was renowned for his photographs of the Acropolis in Athens and the Parthenon in classical antiquity. Working in the 1860s and 70s, really at the advent of photography, because only in the 1840s had Henri Daguerre in Paris begun to develop albumen print photography and then glass lantern slides. And then by the 1850s in the United States, in the 1860s, Matthew Brady made his reputation in introducing grand photography. So this is early in the period. So here you have William James Stillman, with this level of prominence already being selected by McKim, who as a perfectionist would not settle for anything less. And here are the images, the haunting images of, this is the Erechtheum on the Acropolis in Athens. These haunting images that Stillman is capturing. Here's the interior, not the typical view of the front of the building. And I'd like to focus on this doorway, this classical doorway with its brackets, the crispness of this. And I see Redwood Library every time I look at it, here to here, from Redwood's door. So Newport was rich in classical imagery. Here's the Greek door, Redwood door. Stillman did not photograph Redwood Library, but you see he came upon a community with both a classical tradition and what I would call a vernacular building tradition of modest rural buildings. Well, in Whitehall, he found both formal front, vernacular north side. Just as an example, there are many photographs in the album, but here's another prominent one, and it's very similar to the approach taken to Whitehall. This is a view of the Colony House, but it's not the formal grand front of the Colony House. It's a view of the Colony House from the, from its eastern side looking west at what would be present-day Barney Street. They captured the very random-looking, asymmetrical grouping of vernacular buildings, modest shingled buildings that had grown over time with added wings and rustic shingle skin. McKim was interested in history, but he was also interested in colonial sources that could inspire his contemporary design. He loved the complex asymmetry of this urban grouping, and he loved the sweeping rear gable of Whitehall. And it influences this in 1882 to 83, the Isaac Bell House on Bellevue Avenue by the newly formed firm of McKim, Mead, and White. I'm not showing you the Bellevue Avenue facade. I'm showing you the rear facade, because look at the number of gables, the asymmetry, the rough-hewn shingle skin, and the complexity of this, as if he turned this neighborhood and this sweeping gable with its shingled skin and its various parts into this building, which took contemporary design by storm. Mrs. Bell happened to be the sister of James Gordon Bennett, who had already hired the firm to design the Newport Casino in 1879. So the reputation was made with that. So of course they were selected to the Bell House. The Bell House and the buildings like it in Newport, with their rustic shingled skins and their part colonial inspiration, they've come to be known as the shingle style. It's an apt name, but it's not the original name. The shingle style as a name was invented by the historian from Yale, Vincent Scully, when he was hired by the Newport Preservation Society to do a survey of Newport buildings, along with the great preservationist Antoinette Downing in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Vincent Scully did the 19th century inventory, and of course, she and Scully would then, in 1952, publish the architectural heritage of Newport, Rhode Island. He used the term shingle style, and it stuck. But the name given to this house and buildings like it in the 1880s is very telling. It was called the modernized Colonial. They were looking to a colonial past and using it as inspiration for the present. And of course, Newport to them was a timeless place, rich in everything from Whitehall to the Colony House, Road Library. Other artists were coming to the town and celebrating its colonial past. In 1901, the great American impressionist Charles Follen produced this work entitled Churchyard in Newport. It's Trinity Church, of course. He didn't name it, he just said churchyard, sometimes known as Old Churchyard in Newport or White Church at Newport. With his soft impressionist brush, he captures the steeple. Mind you, this building is 1726. So of course, Berkeley knew this building, donates the organ. And of course, he's living at Whitehall in 1729 and thereafter. So this is the grandest existing building in Newport when he's here. And Follen also captures it, surrounded in 1901 by really the urban forest and all of this urban greenery. So photographer, architect, writer, painter are focusing on 18th century Newport in the latter part of the 1870s, 80s, and thereafter. And Whitehall is one of those sites cast in a very romantic way. Here is an engraving of the house, always the ubiquitous sheep in the field in front and the cattle on the side, the grand old ancient tree there, the double doorways captured, the salt box at the side. As Newport rose to fame as a summer resort in the late 19th century, engravers were very busy making images of its colonial buildings, from the romantically interpreted stone tower or Viking tower in town, through Colony House, Trinity Church, and Whitehall was included. Again, not just for the building itself, its association with Berkeley, it's also its setting, this amazingly beautiful, of course, pastoral setting going down to the sea and so close to the city itself. I want to spend a moment, though, talking about another house that I feel represents the same passion for the colonial and the colonial revival at this time. As I was thinking about Whitehall, and again, putting it in a larger context, it has its 18th century significance, which the colonial dames have done so much to preserve and to propagate, and it also has a colonial revival influence. Well, so does this house. It's called Hamilton House, and it's owned by Historic New England. It's on the Salmon Falls River in South Berwick, Maine, and it was built in the late 1770s, 1780s by a wealthy lumber merchant, Mr. Hamilton. It's a very formal, grand Georgian house. You see the pedimented doorway, that Georgian prototype, just as you saw at Whitehall. Now here you see it today as it's preserved in its pure 18th century form. However, like Whitehall, there's a story here. Sarah Orne Jewett, a writer in the mid to late 19th century, lived in South Berwick, Maine. She was of an old family of sea captains, enormously popular writer. She was beginning to see a disappearing way of life in the Salmon Falls River area and also the Piscataqua River, because this region is right on the border, South Berwick, of Maine and New Hampshire, and the river systems end up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. great shipping center in the 18th century, and all of the lumber would come down. The great pine forest from New Hampshire provided the mass for shipbuilding. Well, she began to write books that were enormously popular that captured the old ways of life, fishing, farming. Her bestseller was The Country of the Pointed Firs. Well, she befriended a railroad heiress from Boston, Massachusetts, and convinced her to visit her in South Berwick. And she showed her this house, which at the time was crumbling. Sarah Orne Jewett longed to have someone restore it. Mrs. Tyson, the railroad heiress, fell in love with it, as did her stepdaughter, who would eventually become a Mrs. Vaughan. They engaged in 1901 in a restoration of it in a very romantic colonial revival way. They preserved the main building with its grand doorways, but they added a modern kitchen and bathroom so they wouldn't, in a wing, so they wouldn't destroy the core of the colonial building. Then they covered it with trellising. This is a photograph when the renovations were new. Ivy would grow up this and mask it mostly from public view. Here you have alternating pediments. So this is a photograph from just about 1902. And here is Mrs. Tyson in her colonial revival garden before the building. Once restored, this house inspired Sarah Orne Jewett to write The Tory Lover, a romance taking place between a British loyalist and a Yankee maiden in the Revolutionary period. Why do I compare these two buildings? They're both masterworks of colonial design. Whitehall being a house that evolved over time, a salt box, a modest salt box with a grand front, associated though with the legendary mythic figure of Berkeley. Hamilton House was a home of a prominent merchant like anyone else, but Sarah Orne Jewett, through her literature, mythologized the house, and it captured the romance that people associated with the colonial period. Actually, it overly romanticized it, but both as a result of the mythic quality of both sites resulted in their preservation. And I think that is what is so key here. If we go back to Berkeley, here we see in a very romantic engraving from the first half of the 20th century. And this, by the way, this illustration is entirely colonial revival. The graphic design work, the lettering is classic colonial revival from the period about 1910 right through the 1930s. This is a typeface you see in Dean Berkeley in his study of Whitehall, built for him in 1730, his home during his residence in Rhode Island. Here he is in his armchair, tripod table on one side, books about him, that romantic view. But it's, again, in my book, Newport, the Artful City, I write about 18th century Newport and its environs. And I do talk about the practical aspects of romantic interpretation of historic sites that raise awareness, thus increase the perception and understanding of value, and then it leads to their historic preservation. So with that, I'll leave you with Berkeley in his chair and all the romantic musings one can summon up.